the biggest panic, the biggest damage that we are seeing from the Ukraine war, outside of Ukraine, obviously, is in China. Because in 1 month, the Russians have pulled back the blinders on what has been a 50-year strategic program. The idea that China can become the global power with American sponsorship, with American indifference, that it can take Taiwan, that it can intimidate Japan, that it can dominate all of East Asia, and yet not suffer economically at all. It was always ridiculous, but now it's been shown to just be absolutely stupid. Now, the question moving forward, of course, is what's the next thing the United States is going to care about? And considering how erratic our politics have been for the last 15 years, that's a tough question, but it's something that every single country that trades now has to obsess about if they want to continue doing anything along the lines that they thought they could. And the yuan is only traded internally because it's the most manipulated currency in history. The euro confiscates bank deposits to pay for bailouts. Are there things that the Fed could do better, in my opinion? Of course. But compared to all the competition, I mean, there isn't any competition. Russia is the world's second largest oil exporter, and it exports via 4 main routes, one to China, one to the Baltic Sea, one to the Black Sea, and then on via pipe to Europe. What's going on right now because of the Ukraine war is that the pipes that go to Europe are going to be disrupted either by the war itself or because Ukrainian partisans are targeting Russian income flows. One way or another, those pipes aren't surviving this year. The stuff that goes to the Black Sea is in a war zone. So insurance companies will not give the indemnification that is necessary for vessels to operate in that area. So the only way a ship can go and dock at Novorossiysk right now is if a country gives its sovereign indemnification and takes all the risk. Some of that is happening with the Chinese. It might be happening with the Indians. That's a little touch you can go. They're still under negotiation. Primorsk, that's the Baltic port, so right next to St. Petersburg. That is not in a war zone. So you can get insurance to go to Primorsk. However, ship captains, for the most part, are refusing to go, and European dock workers are refusing to unload the cargo when it arrives. So that is still in use, but not nearly as much, maybe a quarter of what it used to be before the war started. And then the final pipes either terminate Pacific coast near Vladivostok, or there is a short spur line that goes down into Daqing in northeastern China. The western 3, Black Sea, the pipes to Europe, Baltic Sea, those are interconnected to a degree. So if there's a problem at one port or on one pipe, they can redirect some, less than a third, but some of the crude to other places. It is completely disconnected from the eastern pipes that go to China and Japan. So if all the stuff in the West is shut down, which is what I think is going to happen, none of it can go east. The rail line is already operating beyond capacity. The pipelines are already full. You would have to build a fundamentally new infrastructure from the fields in northwest Siberia to Chinese population centers. That is greater than the distance from Miami to Anchorage, most of which is through virgin territory that is very rugged. That's a 10-year program, minimum, even with the Chinese building it. So one way or another, we are looking at those Western flows, which add up to 4 to 5 million barrels a day, going offline. There's still about 1.5 million barrels refined product that might go out, but most of that is going out via rail. So that'll be a little trickier to disrupt. I figure the Europeans can maybe disrupt half of that if they really want to. But we're looking at the single largest removal of crude from the market ever. And in proportional terms, it's going to have a shock somewhat similar to World War II. And that assumes that there are no downstream effects anywhere. Because we have insurance companies not doing it, shipping companies not doing it, dock workers not doing it, and now Halliburton, Baker Hughes, and Schlumberger have pulled out, and they do the technical work that makes a lot of this possible. All the super majors are gone. We even have a couple of major projects out in Sakhalin that are probably just going to die because the Russians can't make those projects work by themselves. Most of the oil and gas out of that goes to China. So we're actually looking at an environment where the Chinese see reduced flows rather than increased, as Russia is just melon scooped out of the market. I would say there are 2 kind of main threads here. The first one is at the end of World War II, the Americans changed how the world worked. We created free trade and globalization and told everyone that they could participate in any market anywhere without military escort. They could access our market if in exchange they formed an alliance with us against the Soviets. We bought an alliance, and we guaranteed as part of that alliance their energy flows. So the primary reason that the US has been so bogged down in the Middle East for so long was because we had to in order to keep our alliance fueled. If the Middle East would have gone offline, the European alliance would have shattered and the Soviets would have walked away with Europe. That was the logic. Post-Cold War, we kept holding up the ceiling. We kept up our end of the deal, but there was no boogeyman. So people went their own ways. And in many times, that meant that they started signing deals with the Russians. It's kind of thread one. Thread two, Europe's a nasty place. Its history is horrific, and the world wars were just the capstone of what had been a millennia of conflict. And so with the American-led order, the Europeans let themselves believe, let themselves hope that history had finally turned the page and that they were finally had all that behind them. And in that sort of environment, especially in the post-Cold War version of it where the Germans had reunified, Russia was seen as a country that in the end needed to be incorporated into the European family so that Europe could finally be whole, at peace, and free. It didn't work. And so we're dealing with a lot of shattered dreams in Europe right now, right alongside with the war, because a lot of people's guiding ideology and hopes for the future died on February 22nd when the Russians moved in the tanks. And so one of the reasons I think that the European response has been so vitriolic is that they're not just disappointed here. They feel betrayed, that their whole idea of what could happen isn't going to happen anymore. And in their mind, it's very clear who's at fault. The last time the Russians interfered with exports from the former Soviet Union, it was 2010. And they had had a bad harvest and a drought and a lot of fires in Western Siberia where they grow a fair amount of their wheat. So they blocked exports for a couple of months. That drove global wheat prices up by a factor of 2. Remember, food, especially base commodities like wheat, have inelastic demand. So it doesn't take much of a disruption in supply to make prices go bonkers. In their primary export markets, which are the Middle East, prices tripled. And that triggered the series of coups and revolts and wars that we now come to know as the Syrian Civil War and the Arab Spring. So, small amount disrupted, prices tripled in the Middle East, doubled globally, big deal. We're still feeling the effects of that. Oh, this is going to be so much worse. So Russia is the world's largest wheat exporter, and most of their wheat is exported via Novorossiysk, the port that can't be accessed right now. And Russia, the world's largest wheat exporter, has invaded Ukraine, the world's 5th largest wheat exporter, and they are making a drive for the city of Odessa, which is where the Iranians offload all of their wheat. So we're looking at 2 of the top 5, maybe not vanishing. Well, Ukraine's vanishing from the market. Ukraine's going to be a net importer this year. They can't plant anymore. But a lot of the Russian production is not going to be able to make it to the global market. Only if they can rail it to you can you still get it. So Iran's probably okay. There's going to be a little bit more maybe going to China, and that's everybody. Everyone else who relied upon Russian wheat, you're just out of luck. And if you relied on Ukrainian wheat, it's just gone and it's not coming back this decade. That's all piece 1. That's just piece 1. We had a phosphate and a nitrogen fertilizer shortage globally when this all started. You need natural gas to make nitrogen. The European fertilizer manufacturers have already suspended most of their nitrogen fertilizer production because of what's going on with the Ukraine war, and the cost is already, I believe today we're at $60 per 1,000 cubic feet in Europe for natural gas versus the United States, which is like 4.5. So, there's no way you can be viable making nitrogen at that prices, and that's without sanctions. And 40% of the world's potash comes from either Russia or Belarus. So we now also have a potash shortage because they can't get that to market. So all 3 of the primary components that go into all fertilizers are in shortage globally. It takes a minimum of 3 years to build out the physical infrastructure to bring a new phosphate a new phosphate or nitrogen facility online, and probably closer to 10 years to get the mine and the mill situation in place for potash. So this isn't a 1-year issue. This is a multi-year issue. And we're going to have a lot of countries around the world, particularly on the poorer side, that just aren't going to be able to use fertilizer this year, which means their yields will crash. The number 1 importer of Russian fertilizer is Brazil. That's the world's 2nd largest agricultural exporter. So at a minimum, we're going to see the prices for their output going up stratospherically. This is more than enough to trigger a multi-continent famine that starts probably in the 3rd or 4th quarter of this year and then just doesn't let up for quite some time.